So now we're going to soft erase this and lay in the anatomy. So I tend to look at this like a mannequin or a marionette. So something that is there for structure, but at the same time, if I need to change something, if there's a way to make it better, then I'm still open to that way of thinking. I think that's very important to do all the way to the end result of your work. But as I've mentioned before, in a productive manner where you're constantly pushing yourself forward so that you do end up with completed works of art and not in a perpetual motion or a perpetual state of just studying and just developing. It can be a bit of a double-edged sword. So with the deltoid, notice that I used a pretty heavy line and then I showed a pretty significant shadow in that clavicular fossa. Again, a really good landmark to memorize. It's hard to say, obviously, for me, but it's a good one. And just like knowing that the neck muscles go right down to that jugular fossa, the sternocleidomastoids point down into that jugular fossa. And again, these little landmarks go a long ways to helping you do this from imagination and from memory. And let me just say that that doesn't mean that if you get stuck on a specific area, that does not mean don't pull reference. Look at reference whenever you need it. Use it in whatever way feels comfortable for you. I like to challenge myself to draw as much from my mind as possible. But then if there's an area of the body that's not looking right and there's a pose that is salvageable, then I'm definitely going to pull from reference. So taking nothing off the table, always be open to that. We constantly need to revisit anatomy and parts of the anatomy. So we're going to get into specific studies, and forgive me if these lessons are out of order. So if I'm saying we're going to get into a specific study and it's in a previous section, I'm dividing this up and delving into different areas of this. Since figure drawing is so vast, I want to approach a lot of different aspects for you. So some of these lessons may seem out of order, but they'll be in order based upon the sections. So again, there's areas of the body that I constantly revisit, and it's we're going to talk extensively about knees and the legs and the way the legs look from different angles. Very important. And just like this area here with the deltoid, so the pectoralis muscle goes up, and I showed in a previous lesson how it actually goes in front of the deltoid when the arms are raised like this, especially if you rotate your hands backwards. But through force of habit, I'm actually illustrating this in a way where the anterior head is in front of the pectoralis. I end up correcting that here, but I just want you to be aware of that sometimes the force of habit of what we thought we knew is still evident, and we have to get rid of that through repetition. And it's tough when something kind of looks right, so you're on the fence a little bit. You're like, oh, it doesn't look that bad. I think that's a pretty good shoulder. That's when it becomes really tricky to get it out of your process, because it doesn't ring a bell as being horrible or a sore thumb kind of appearance. So we have to be very diligent in our pursuit of how to draw the body. And again, those studies over and over, just when you think you know it, going back and revisiting it. And areas I can definitely attest to that would be really connection points, shoulders, knees, the way the leg looks when it raises up and in the hip joint, and those forms change so dramatically, not just person to person, but just certain angles. And you're looking at it. The back is a really good example. We're going to have to do lots of studies with the back, because just when you think you know it, you go to draw it or paint it from a particular angle, and the forms almost look like a new language. Like it just seems like it's something you've never seen before from that particular angle. And that's just how tricky the anatomy can be. But again, through lots of practice, it starts to make more sense. You start to find rhythms and patterns, and you start to find your own way as well. But it's definitely something that is manageable, right? There's lots of great artists that do figure drawing beautifully. And that gives me a bit of solace, and it should make you feel better as well. that it's not an insurmountable task. It's a tough task, but that's what makes it so coveted and such a wonderful thing to pursue. So just like this hand here, it's like I feel myself struggling and I'm trying to find the forms, and I've drawn plenty of hands, especially a closed fist. It's easier than an open hand pose. Yet I still struggle from time to time with maybe a particular angle or getting the forms to look organic enough and not look like just a strange hand. And I oftentimes have to draw hands at least twice, sometimes more than that. And just to let you know, this particular one is a little bit sped up, not much. I think the percentage is 130%, meaning it's only a little bit faster than it was really drawn at. I just needed it to conform into the specs that are needed for course creation. But I want you to know that certain lessons I am going to give to you in real time because I feel like it's necessary in some instances, but some of it will be redundant, and I'm going to speed that up a little bit just to keep you hopefully engaged in the content. But I'm always willing to hear your feedback on what you would like to see and what you would like to know, again, in real time or sped up. Give me all the details and information you can so that I can make better content for you. So notice the serratus. I really want to point those out that, I drew a few of them and then I blended it off. So I softened them up. Same thing with the abdominal muscles. Through force of habit, I almost want to draw them in very segmented ways, but I remind myself to use line breaks, and I want to perceive that the forms are solid and visible in some areas and less visible in others. So again, the serratus is a good example of that, or the serratus and the way that it reacts into the obliques is another example of that. Another thing with the leg here, the leg is, I'm trying to get a sort of bumpiness on the bottom of the leg. So I end up using a dip right under the glute there. And I feel like it almost could have been a line cutting into the other form, but sometimes it's better to use these little, I don't know how to really explain them, other than these little bumps and these little dips into the anatomy. Generally, it will make it look more realistic. Now, obviously, it needs to be coupled with knowledge of what's really there, right? You can't just put bumps and dips wherever in the perimeter of the drawing. It won't make any sense. But I want you to pay special attention to that. So when you're doing your studies, when you're studying an arm or a leg, really look for that. Look at the way a certain part of the anatomy comes in front of another area. So in this case, the lower leg goes in front of the upper leg quite considerably. And that coupled with showing the plane changes and the rigidness, the rigid kind of landmarks of the knee area shows that that leg, lower leg, is definitely in front of the upper leg. So you have very distinct lines that cut right in front of the other areas. That's a bit easier to discern. But what's not as easy to discern and equally as important are the subtleties of the bends and bumps of the anatomy. And it's very easy to skip over those and just use like a nice elegant curve and basically draw right through and around it. But that's not how you get better. So it's paying attention to those tiny little details and trying to incorporate those into your work. Even if they're not 100% accurate, it's better to try it, put it in there, and then you're at least in the right direction of incorporating that into your work and then adjusting it as you go. So now down to the foot area, and just like hands, feet are a harder area of the body for me, so I usually draw them at least a couple times. Now, again, we will be doing hands and feet in detail because they are that type of area of the body. They require lots of attention, but I'll show you some techniques where it does make them a little bit easier to draw out. Like one of the techniques is just a little bit of a zigzag bump over the knuckles of the toes. I don't think I did it extremely well here, but I'll show you in more detail and it'll make more sense. And it's really a great way to kind of draw toes. And just some references that I can throw out there for you. Some books that I would recommend that help with that quite considerably would be Bern Hogarth's Dynamic Anatomy and George Bridgman's Constructive Anatomy. So both do a really nice job. They're very different approaches. I think that's a good thing, though. You want to look at lots of different artists and their approaches. It's very easy to look at, an artist you admire and seeing the end result of their work, but it's the approach that you need to know about sometimes, and really the fundamental knowledge even behind the approach. So when you see these breakdowns, and again, we'll address this in more detail on these areas and lots of areas. I want to do some simplified anatomy throughout the body so that it gives you a better working knowledge of kind of my thought process behind why I draw the way that I do. And again, how that you might develop that on your own once you have a system of looking at certain things and seeing the relationship of the forms and the shapes. Then rendering it and drawing it becomes a lot easier. So again, really recommend those books. They've been instrumental for my growth, and hopefully they do the same for you. So now with this lower back leg, one thing I wanted to point out here is that it's very easy to get caught up into drawing a silhouette and a perimeter-like shape to an area of the anatomy like this. And I want you to really avoid that. And believe me, I'm talking to you, but I'm expressing what I've dealt with in my own pursuit. That it's very easy to just say, well, I think it'll work. I think it'll look fine. But then you start to ignore the subtleties of the angles of the anatomy, which really makes the dimension come through a lot better, a lot more realistic. So be careful of that. And I think that I even needed to take that a bit further here, that you really have to pay attention to the way a leg looks as it goes back into space, where the heel reacts and lands in comparison to the ankle and to the upper portion. Well, by upper, I mean above the heel, the anatomy below the calf, how it intersects into the heel. As that leg pushes back, the heel starts to be behind that lower portion of the leg. So again, it's those subtleties. And for instance, I could take a foot and say, well, I'm just going to draw the foot to the side. And that's a really bad thing to do, because feet are almost never just the perimeter silhouette of a foot. In fact, again, this one here could have been a lot more interesting by curving that foot around, showing a little bit more of the back, or in this case, a little bit more of the front where the toes are. Again, trying not to think of the body in terms of silhouettes. Now, silhouette illustration is great for spotting errors in the overall design of the character and the body. But again, not jumping to that because it's easier, because it's a very bad habit, and it's you're not going to learn as much about anatomy if you do that. So you have to look for those subtleties where the hand turns away from the view and you see a little bit of the top and some of the bottom fingers as they curl around, little things like that. So again, feet, hands are prime examples of those areas. So here, just trying to get the arm to not look too overly flat. So even though I push the arm back in a very linear way from the body, I have to try to express it in a way that it doesn't look flat. Because, like I've mentioned before, anatomy is never stacked. It's never flat. It flows in and around other areas of the body. It's not side by side. So again, I have to really think about that as I render this and design a little bit more into it, because if not, same thing with the silhouette effect, I'll get a flat representation of an arm, and that's just not what we want, right? We want an arm that looks like it has volume and occupies space. Even though we're just using basic lines here, we still have to try to be aware of that and make that come through in our illustration. And so now just kind of finalizing this artwork, and we'll wrap this one up here. So hopefully this particular lesson has been informative for you and showing you how to approach the body in a little bit more of a dynamic way, in a more interesting way. So with that, let's move on to our next lesson.